Welcome to Skol Sessions, the Viking Athletics podcast where strength meets smarts. I'm your host, Eric Castiglione, owner and head coach in Viking Athletics, and our topic for today is it CrossFit? I'm going to delve into what makes CrossFit CrossFit and some of the other variations out there and how all that ties together. What prompted this? There are numerous coaches out there that are trying to differentiate themselves from CrossFit to sell their own brand. And of course, they're bashing CrossFit in the process, even though they're still using some of its methodologies. So I want to delve into what makes CrossFit CrossFit. But before we do that, my beverage for today is a bourbon called Little Book. It was a very, very rare find, and I'm thrilled that I got it. Skol. I'm going to go into a little quick bourbon history lesson. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Jim Beam. Jim's great-grandfather, Jacob Beam, was the first one to distill whiskey in his family. And it was called Old Jake Beam's Sour Mash, is what he called it. Passed the recipe on to his son, who continued distilling it. People picked it up, and it was called Old Tub. And then passed it into Jim's father, who continued to distill and distribute. Heavily affected by Prohibition, Jim Beam took over and rebuilt the business after Prohibition, and before his death, the whiskey became named after him. So that became Jim Beam. His son continued distilling, and ownership over the next several years changed a number of times, but eventually his grandson, Booker No, became the master distiller and expanded the brand, buying other sub-brands, Old Crow, reacquired Old Tub, and also introduced Booker, which was his single barrel bourbon. Very harsh, very uncut, unfiltered. And we are now into the 8th generation. Little Freddie. Freddie now is known as Little Book. So Booker's great-grandson is now running the business. And so 8th generation of that Jim Beam family. So it's very rare. It's distributed randomly throughout the US. So I was very lucky to find it. Anyway, for anyone that cares about bourbon, Skol. Moving on. What makes CrossFit CrossFit? To examine that, we have to look at where CrossFit came from. So founder Greg Glassman was a personal trainer that used unorthodox methods for his clients. Rather than use machines in the gym, he preferred to use free weights, compound barbell movements, deadlifts, clean, snatches, and he incorporated gymnastics. Now, if you've ever attempted to do that in a facility like LA Fitness or Workout World, places that existed prior to the Edge, prior to when a number of fitness facilities put in deadlift platforms and things like that, people would look at you like you had two heads, and you would frequently be asked not to do that. So now imagine that an employee of that facility is the one making you do these things. You can imagine that it didn't go over so well with management and some of the other clients. So Glassman was thrown out of facility after facility and eventually opened his own. And that was the original CrossFit gym. So it started out as a personal training methodology. And then once Greg was running his own facility, he realized it made more financial sense to try to do small groups. So he would have a personal training client bring a friend or a spouse, and he would train both of them in a session. And it allowed him to build a sustainable business, which he then grew from there. When he first started trying to promote it in the greater fitness space, he founded CrossFit.com, and this is where a lot of the misconceptions as to what CrossFit is began. So CrossFit.com was launched in 2001, and you could log on and you would find the workout of the day. And it would be one component. It might be a lift, and you're doing a heavy set of 5 front squats that day, building up. It might be a 10K run. It might be the typical kind of CrossFit Metcon that has become synonymous with CrossFit these days. But it was only one component. So it led people to believe that That's all CrossFit was that WOD. That's CrossFit. What people seem to forget is when you're running a personal training session, people are with you for an entire hour. So if you're just making them do a 10-minute Metcon in an hour, what the hell are they paying for? So Greg would actually have people do some kind of strength work or dedicated skill work prior to hitting this Metcon, if time allowed for it, which is similar to what we do in Viking athletics. In later years, that became known as doing a strength bias, or something like that. But it was always part of his initial training methodology. And because this idea that it's that one workout got perpetuated, in the early days of the CrossFit Games, people would look at the best athletes, and there was a saying going around that the best CrossFit athletes don't do CrossFit. And so what was meant by that was, if you look back at the early games, 2007, 2008, these athletes still pretty much followed that. They did the one workout a day, warm up, maybe some strength work, hit a Metcon, and that's it. And it wasn't until 2009 when you had Mikko Salo from Finland absolutely crush things, and people were like, well, what's this guy doing? And they looked into his training, and he was a Finnish firefighter and rescue diver, and he was probably the first in the CrossFit world to do multiple workouts in a day. His job required it. So he'd be up in the morning doing cardio, and then maybe in the afternoon he'd get a lift in, and then in the evening he would do a Metcon. So he was the very first to kind of do multiple workouts in a day. Enter Rich Froning in 2010, when he famously failed to climb a rope and took second place in the games. You listen to his story, and he's like, we wanted a little bit more after this workout, so we did a second WOD. And we looked at each other like, is this going to kill us? Oh no, we're okay. And, his training evolved from there, and it included multiple workouts in a day. At one point during an interview, he said he works out 5-6 times a day, which people also misconstrued to think that he was training for 5 to 6 hours a day, not realizing that while he was working in the Tennessee Tech weight room as a strength and conditioning coach, one of his workouts was something simple like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 of bench press and pull-ups, weighted pull-ups. It's a short little quick workout like that, but that was one of the 6. He would get up and do a 2K row every morning. That was his recovery. So once these athletes started incorporating multiple components into their training, that was when the idea that, CrossFit athletes don't do CrossFit kind of came into play. But again, it's all a misconception. So what is it that constitutes CrossFit? And if you actually go through the level 1, you'll learn the definition of CrossFit, which is constantly varied functional movements executed at high intensity. And there's some nuggets of wisdom in there. We've talked ad nauseum in the past about intensity being relative, and you don't need to constantly train at maximal intensity. High intensity doesn't necessarily mean all out 100%. I've also discussed what is a functional movement, and CrossFit has a number of criteria for that as well. Core to extremity, multi-joint, compound movements. And then, I've made the argument that used correctly, every movement is kind of functional. You look at biceps curls, and in the early days of CrossFit, I still remember my gym in Philadelphia in the early days there. If you did biceps curls, the owner would threaten to kick you out because it was non-functional. And yet, if you look at strongman, you're carrying large loads in front of you, and look at the games this year, they had the Husafell carry amongst other strongman disciplines. And biceps are heavily involved in holding that weight in front of you. So yeah, I'm going to use biceps curls because it's going to strengthen me for this other movement that I can then deem functional. And you can also look at high-level CrossFitter Jason Kalipa just posted a video of himself doing 21s, which is an old school meathead style little workout for the biceps. You do 7 full range of motion biceps curls, 7 half range top down, and then 7 half range bottom up. So you're not even getting a full range of motion in all 21 movements. It's a purpose purposeful limiting of the range of motion to target the biceps. Is it functional? I make the argument yes. CrossFit, maybe not necessarily. So everybody has this kind of nebulous idea of what CrossFit is, but I think what really sets it apart is not the intensity, not the fact that you're going against a clock. It's really the fact that you are borrowing movements from numerous other disciplines and you're trying to get good at all of them. It's that cross-training element. So this gets confusing with some people. There's another movement out there called being a hybrid athlete, which is when you are working on, call it, two disciplines at complete opposite ends of the spectrum. So I'm a power lifter and I want to be better at running. So those are the complete opposite ends of the spectrum, or you do vice versa. I'm a runner, but I want to take up powerlifting. And in that instance, you're a specialist in one, and then you take up the other one to try to become a little bit more proficient in it. So you've got running powerlifters and powerlifting runners. Those are only two of the disciplines that CrossFit borrows. CrossFit also uses kettlebells, weightlifting, strongman implements. Again, we've been seeing a lot more of those in the games lately. Gymnastics is a huge component. Running, rowing, swimming. And of course, it was not uncommon for Greg actually had mountain bikes in his original gym, and it was not unheard of for him to tell people, here, take this bike, go for a bike ride, that's your workout for today. So it's the idea that we're stealing from multiple different disciplines, and we're trying to be proficient at all of them. I'm not trying to specialize in any one and be really, really good at any single one of them. Got to be good at everything. And that's what sets CrossFit apart. It's the fact that there's such a wide variety of movements to master. And again, in the early days of CrossFit, there was a lot of pushback against this. Part of that was fear of people's disciplines being replaced by CrossFit. Part of that was the fact that the way Greg tried to carve out space in the industry, he was very brash and, butted heads with everybody. So you look at some of the early workshops that he did, and he would argue, you got these world-class powerlifters that are squatting over 1,000 pounds, and it's, yeah, but what's his Fran time? See, he's not fit, because the guy didn't meet the CrossFit definition of fitness. He was a specialist, not a generalist. So again, that led to a ton of pushback, and you would get people saying that CrossFit athletes are the best at exercising. They're not really athletes. They're not good at sports. And, CrossFit makes you mediocre at everything, which I think has, especially at the top level, very much been put to rest. You've got Tia Toomey, who actually qualified for the Summer Olympics in the sport of weightlifting. You've got a number of the high-level men whose numbers would put them in national competition for the sport of weightlifting. They wouldn't win, but they're at that level. So they're developed enough, they're still at the national level for weightlifting, but they can also run a sub 6 minute mile, and they can swim, and they can walk on their hands, and they can do high rep pull-ups. So it is building proficiency at all these different modalities and actually focusing on them that makes CrossFit CrossFit. It is the movements. It's that massive inclusion. So where we are now, 21 years after CrossFit.com launched, is we've seen a number of these kind of side businesses grow alongside CrossFit, and they really do have CrossFit to thank for this. So for everyone that's saying, oh, this isn't CrossFit, and pointing out everything, if you look over the history of CrossFit through the years, numerous kind of specialty shoot-offs have actually arisen because of it. You had CrossFit Endurance, which was supposed to help people with their monostructural work. Or, I'm a marathoner, but I don't want to abandon the CrossFit methodology completely. You had CrossFit Football, which then became sport-specific CrossFit, and is now known as Power Athlete HQ. They've continued to evolve their methods. And, once again, Power Athlete HQ is something that now kind of puts down traditional CrossFit because they branched off from it and they want to differentiate themselves. So naturally, they're going to put down their competitors. And we see that a lot because we frequently define ourselves by denying the opposite. What am I? It's easier to say what I'm not than it is to say what I am. So you've seen that evolution with Power Athlete HQ. I've worked with a number of coaches that used to program for CrossFit. One of them now doesn't even include burpees in his programming. One of them got rid of kipping completely and basically doesn't do, other than push-ups and pull-ups, doesn't really do any traditional gymnastics or calisthenics. And again, it's people trying to carve out a market share, and to do that, they have to differentiate themselves from what CrossFit is. I always say that what we do at Viking Athletics is CrossFit but smarter. It's my own twist on CrossFit, and I've imposed a actual structure over it to make it less random, still constantly varied, but not random. And if I wanted to branch off and brand it under my own name or something like that, a good starting point would be trying to, bash something that CrossFit's doing and say that we're doing it better, because CrossFit is a well-known brand. And I can say it's like CrossFit except this, and it again has that kind of brand recognition. People will be like, okay, it's similar to CrossFit, but you don't do this. And it's a very powerful way to differentiate myself. I'm not going to do that because I firmly believe in CrossFit and the methodology. But because the brand has grown, it has allowed all these spin-offs. You've also got SEALFIT. That a number of early adopters of CrossFit were special forces operators, and they took the methodology, expanded on it, and grew their own program that's a little bit more applicable to the demands of their job. You have CrossFit Kids, which then the founders broke off and started Brand X, which Viking Athletics is the only Brand X affiliate in the state of Connecticut. But it's still similar to CrossFit. There are minor differences, and it's once again people trying to distance themselves from what they once did to carve out their own space in that market share. And it's not just people trying to establish themselves that way. There have been symbiotic relationships over the years with other companies. Look at the equipment suppliers. Rogue Fitness didn't exist when CrossFit was launched. You'd be lucky to get a slam ball from Muscle Driver. You could get wall balls from Dynamics. You had to go to all these different suppliers to try to carve out specialty equipment. Bumper plates are now ubiquitous. They weren't. Again, Faster was another equipment supplier that sprouted from this. And then, of course, you've got, if there's equipment, you've got people that need to service it. Our very own Jim Phelps started his business, CrossFixit, servicing CrossFit equipment. So, for all these people that are bashing it, they've really reaped the benefits of it, and I think they lose sight of where they're coming from. So, at the end of the day, the CrossFit business model is great because it allows this freedom to do all these things. You've got Mayhem programming. You've got all these sub-brands underneath the CrossFit flag. Heck, the first champion of the CrossFit Games is James OPT Fitzgerald, who now runs OPEX, which is its own educational certification now. It's its own method of training. You can become an OPEX affiliate. You could be a Mayhem affiliate. You could follow CompTrain. There are so many options out there now that's all grown up around the CrossFit methodology. So as much as people want to bash it, I think they lose sight of the fact that it's helped them and really gotten them to where they are. And at the end of the day, that's one of the beauties of the business system, is it allows for the freedom to do what you want to do. It's the affiliate model. It's not a franchise. It's helped so many industries along the way. And at the end of the day, what makes CrossFit CrossFit is the movements and the intent to develop proficiency in numerous different disciplines. Again, you're being a generalist, so there's always something to work on. You're not specializing in any given discipline. So, frequently, if you see someone bashing CrossFit, you can take a look at their system and look at the similarities, and I guarantee a lot of it came from that, especially if it's a person that used to be affiliated in some way, shape, or form. So, anyway, that's kind of my rant / explanation over why we're doing this. Is it CrossFit? Yeah, put your own twist on it. CrossFit allows it, they encourage it, and I'm very curious to see the future of CrossFit, especially with the new corporate structure. Hopefully they don't change too much, and hopefully they continue to allow affiliates to do what they want to do and support them in the best way possible. And I have nothing but good things to say so far about the ownership change. So we'll see what happens. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to go ahead and finish this. Skol. And we'll catch you next month. See you in the gym.